War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 106, Urgent Fury. Operation Urgent Fury was the 1983 United States military intervention in Grenada. It began on October 25th and involved about 7,600 U.S. troops, plus a couple hundred soldiers from various Caribbean countries. The operation removed a Marxist military council that had taken power after the execution of the previously communist, but not communist enough, Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. It protected 1,000 American citizens on the island and restored the quasi-constitutional government. The combat phase lasted about 1 week. Grenada became independent from Britain in 1974. Eric Gary led the country until 1979, when the New Jewel movement seized power in a coup. Maurice Bishop became Prime Minister of the People's Revolutionary Government. Again, he was already a commie. The new government suspended the Constitution, established very close relations with Cuba and the Soviet Union, and accepted Cuban military aid. Cuban workers started construction of a long runway at Point Salinas Airport, and U.S. officials viewed the runway as a potential base for Soviet aircraft, which it unquestionably was. But by 1983, divisions grew inside the government. The revolution always eats itself. Bishop's more moderate approach conflicted with the hardline faction led by Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Couillard. On October 12th, Couillard's supporters placed Bishop under house arrest. There were some protests. October 19th, Bishop's supporters freed him, but forces loyal to Couillard recaptured and executed him, along with several of his ministers at Fort Rupert. General Hudson Austin then formed a Revolutionary Military Council, imposed the curfew, and closed the island. The killings caused some concern across the Caribbean. Leaders of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States met and requested U.S. assistance to restore order and protect regional security. Jamaica and Barbados supported the request. This invitation gave the United States a basis for action in Washington. President Reagan approved the operation on October 23rd. About 1,000 American medical students attended St. George's University School of Medicine. Reports indicated their safety was at risk under the new regime and curfew. The administration also saw the intervention as a way to counter Soviet and Cuban influence in the Caribbean. Planning occurred in less than 48 hours. Keep this in mind, this is important. Secrecy was strict. Many members of Congress learned of the operation only after it started. Admiral McDonald commanded from U.S. Atlantic Command. Vice Admiral Metcalf commanded forces on the scene from the USS Guam. The assault force included the 82nd Airborne Division, 2 battalions of the 75th Regiment, 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit, SEALs, and Delta Force. The plan called for simultaneous operations at 2 airfields. Rangers would seize Point Salinas in the southwest by parachute. Marines would take Pearls Airfield in the southeast by helicopter. Additional units would secure St. George's, rescue the students, and eliminate resistance from Grenadian Army units and Cubans. On October 25th, C-130 aircraft carried Rangers to Point Salinas. They jumped at low altitude and defended areas. Cuban construction workers, surprisingly armed and positioned near the runway, offered stronger resistance than expected. Maybe they weren't construction workers. Rangers cleared the airfield despite obstacles and construction equipment. At the same time, Marines landed by helicopter at Pearls and secured the airfield with naval gunfire support from ships, including the USS New Jersey, 16-inch guns, baby. Fighting continued throughout the day. U.S. forces encountered resistance at Richmond Hill Prison and other positions around the capital. A helicopter was lost near the prison, one of our brand new UH-60s, first time use in combat, the Black Hawk. By the end of the first day, both airfields were under U.S. control. On October 26, forces rescued students at the Grand Anse campus with a helicopter assault supported by AC-130 gunships. Most American citizens were evacuated within the first 2 days. U.S. Army and Marine units then moved to clear St. George's and the rest of the island. Grenadian soldiers usually abandoned their positions, changed into civilian clothes, and just went home. The final major actions took place around Fort Frederick and government buildings. By October 28th, organized resistance ended, and mop-up operations continued until November 2nd, when Major General Troubal declared the operation complete. U.S. casualties, 19 dead, 116 wounded. And most deaths resulted from accidents or friendly fire. Grenadian forces lost about 45 killed, Cuban casualties were 25 dead with 600 captured, twice as many as Grenadans were captured. Again, the Grenadans just kind of disappeared and went home and wanted no more to do with it. Governor General Sir Paul Scoon, who had been under house arrest, was freed and resumed authority under the pre-1979 Constitution. Keep in mind that Grenada was quasi-independent from Great Britain. In fact, it was still technically part of the Commonwealth, which is why the Governor General, Sir Paul Scoon, was still there. An interim council formed and elections were held in 1984. The United States provided reconstruction aid and helped completed the Port Salinas airport. The new Grenadian government removed remaining Cuban and Soviet personnel and aligned with Western countries. Inside the United States, the operation increased public support for Reagan. It was presented as a successful rescue and defense of U.S. interests. Internationally, reaction was, guess what? Negative. The United Nations General Assembly voted 108-9 to deplore the intervention. Okay, so what? Soviet Union, Cuba, and many so-called non-aligned states called it a violation of sovereignty. Well, I guess that's kind of accurate. Britain expressed displeasure over a lack of consultation because Grenada was a Commonwealth nation. Some Caribbean states supported the action while others condemned it. The operation revealed a lot of problems, though. Different services were still using different radios. They couldn't talk to each other. Command arrangements were unclear. These and many other issues contributed to the friendly fire incidents. And then also the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, reorganizing the Department of Defense to improve joint operations and give a lot of more general slots and a lot more awards. You can argue it violated international law, but what is international law but an agreement between sovereigns to behave in a certain way that they'll ignore when they feel like it? So politically, Urgent Fury demonstrated how a small island crisis could draw in superpowers. The internal collapse of the Bishop government created the opening. The regional request and concern for U.S. citizens provided the fig leaf justification. And the execution exposed capabilities and weaknesses in joint military operations. We were club and baby seals at this point. The reforms that followed certainly helped U.S. operations, which would be seen in Just Cause in Panama a few years later. But it has to be understood within the context of, one, the greater Cold War, and the fact that 2 days earlier, the Beirut Marine barracks bombing occurred, which killed 240 Marines while we were protecting the PLO from the Israeli Defense Forces. All right, there's Urgent Fury. Now, the first thing that you often hear about Urgent Fury is that Reagan did it because he wanted to hide what had just happened in Beirut. That's sort of true. The fact is, only 2 days separate the Beirut barracks bombing and Urgent Fury. Planning for the Grenada operation had started before the Beirut barracks bombing. And in fact, the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit had already been diverted from its mission to Beirut before or right when the barracks bombing happened. So they were preparing for an invasion prior to what happened in Beirut. However, the approval happened immediately after. So I think the time, while planning had already happened, I think the timeline was accelerated, which created a lot of the chaos. The reconnaissance that normally would have happened on the ground was rushed, and that caused some deaths. The SEAL Team 6 tried to do an insertion about 25 miles offshore. It was a complete mess. 4 SEALs died. The mission was a complete failure, and they had to abandon it. The SEALs didn't have a real good time with it. The Delta guys had a few operations, did better, but unquestionably, some of the SOCOM actions still suffered. So this is after the failure of Desert One and Eagle Claw in the Iranian desert. So there were a lot of bugs to be worked out. The Democrats in Congress freaked out and continued a series of what's known collectively as the Boland Amendment, but it is actually a bunch of amendments that passed between 1982 and 1986, which was ostensibly aimed at limiting U.S. government assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua. The Contras were fighting the communist Sandinistas. You hear about the Iran-Contra affair with Poindexter and Colonel North. The Boland Amendment was from Representative Boland from Massachusetts, an old school Democrat. He served for 50 years in Congress. Side note, he got married in 1962 to a woman literally half his age. Just found that a little interesting tidbit. Congressmen are weird folks. So the Boland Amendment was 5 legislative amendments, continually increasing restrictions to anti-communist forces in Central America. Grenada accelerated this restriction. Part of the reason the Democrats have that reputation, certainly had it in the 80s, of supporting communists is, well, because they did. You can't forget that Reagan in 1984 was almost a slam dunk win. But Teddy Kennedy, the senator and brother of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, actually sent his close advisor to the Soviet Union in 1984 to coordinate with the Soviet government on how they could defeat Reagan in 1984. It was pretty bad. On a side note, when I was at War College, we got a visit. This often happens at War College, from General Stephen Silvasi Jr., who, as a lieutenant, fought in Power Pack and was a brigade commander in Grenada. Now, being the nerd that I was and knowing that I would have no chance at ever actually being a general officer, I was kind of curious what lessons he learned. He relayed the story that the only fighting that he took part in while he was in Power Pack was with Marines. His platoon got into a firefight with Marines, and he was very proud to state that the Marines retreated. So his one combat action during Power Pack was against Marines, and he won. So when he was a brigade commander and they got orders, he sent one of his captains to the 22nd MU, put him on a helicopter, flew him out there to deconflict and coordinate so there wouldn't be any more friendly fire accidents between his forces and the Marines. It didn't work. There was still friendly fire between his forces. And I think one of the things that I learned from that, and I certainly learned when I was in Afghanistan, is if you're maneuvering aggressively and in a chaotic environment, especially against enemies that don't wear uniforms, and in a dismounted area, it's much harder to differentiate where fire is coming from. You can often tell by the sound that it's coming from. But when you're in canyons and you have people with both types of weapons on both sides, it is absolutely chaotic. So when you hear about friendly fire, and there's been some news recently about the Pat Tillman friendly fire. I was on the SEAL Sean Ryan's podcast talking with the Delta guy. When you hear friendly fire, don't see it as, I won't say a failure, because obviously it's a failure, but it's almost inevitable. If you are aggressive in fighting and you are maneuvering with different forces in the chaos of combat, friendly fire is going to happen. You do everything you can to mitigate it, but there's nothing to stop. When I was in Afghanistan, I was on a mission. You can actually see the clip on YouTube if you look in Taliban Safari. I got shot at. And remember that the Afghan police that I was working with and the Taliban used the same weapon. They were both armed with AKs. And I got shot at, and I got on the radio and I said, I don't know if it's ANA or what, but it came from the wrong direction. That's all I knew. I couldn't identify the source of the fire, which was more often than not. I rarely saw the people who initially shot at me, which is the whole point. You kind of lay in ambush and wait. So friendly fire happens. It's chaotic. And for anyone who is a military professional, especially if you're starting off in your career, everything you can do to minimize fratricide, friendly fire, anything you can do to simplify your plans and use very clear demarcation of controls, do it. You take it for granted that you're going to be able to figure out what's going on, and that's not always the case. This is a kind of a rambling, chaotic thing. I'm going to see how this cleans up in editing. I doubt it will. Anyways, see about next week. I'll either talk about The Pursuit or we'll just move on to Blue Spoon, that later got rebranded as Just Cause. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.